Okay, just give it a second for everything to finish doing its login deal. Computer likes to take its time for this part. All right, but that does give other people time to log in too. So just move this screen over there, minimize that, put that over there, recenter this. Oh, make sure we get back on the top of the page. And I think we're good. Okay, wasn't too painful today. Technology not being too obnoxious. It's nice when it cooperates. All right, give it just another few seconds just to make sure the logins have stopped, or at least have stopped in a timely manner. All right, let's go ahead and begin the introduction. So, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining as we continue our discussion of Jewish eschatology. And yes, for those of you who want really, really hard Scrabble words, eschatology is the study of the end of days. So, this is the topic of what happens at the end. I try to avoid words like Armageddon and the apocalypse because those are all heavily clouded, shaded, and colored by Western civilization and its own obsessions, both theological and pop culture. Instead, wanted to try and give you a slightly less clouded view as we go through Jewish traditions' take on this topic. As we have discussed, Judaism certainly does focus on guiding us for our life in this world, but Olam Haba, the world to come, as it's called, is also extremely important. We have seen examples of that through our tefillah, through our prayer, and remind you, those were only a few tip of the iceberg examples. Just about every page of the Siddur has some relevance and some indication of our hope for the future redemption. We've talked about how the biblical texts are profound, but also extremely difficult to untangle and organize. And we have talked in the last sections about the concept of Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, looking in the text of Sanhedrin, which is this portion of the Talmud, is the most extensive continual discussion of Jewish thoughts on these topics. We've covered the resurrection for the dead, I think, enough for the moment, at least in this section. So we're going to skip ahead just a bit, still staying in that same section of the Talmud, and look at some other topics as well. So buckle up, hang in there, and continue to ask questions either privately or publicly, and let's see what we can learn. Rav Chisda raises a contradiction. Remember, contradiction in Talmudic terminology is not a bad thing. Contradiction means that there are two verses, or sometimes more, that apparently, at a superficial level, appear to contradict one another. They can come from the same text, they can come from opposing texts, but it creates a conundrum. Rather than simply saying, oh, there's no contradictions in the Bible, and pretending like you can't see or understand things that appear to be contradiction, the Talmud and other rabbinic texts will investigate and will, of course, come to the conclusion that this is not a real contradiction in the sense that there is something broken or wrong, but will point out something that can be learned by the unique interplay of two verses that superficially appear to be at odds with one another. So let's see how that plays out here. And then you can file this away as part of your toolkit for what rabbinic texts can bring and how you can react when you, in your own biblical studies, come across things that to you at the moment appear to be a contradiction. Do not take them as being a problem. Take it as being a challenge, as something that needs further investigation because there's something new to learn. It is written from Isaiah 24, then the moon shall be confounded and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts will reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders shall be his glory. All right, so the commentary points out this is indicating that the sun and the moon will no longer shine at the end of days. These are going to be no longer a part of the celestial light show. And it is written, this time in Isaiah 30, and the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days, which the commentary points out indicates that the sun and the moon will exist then, and they will shine more brightly. All right, so there's our contradiction. Isaiah 24, sun and the moon at the end of days, no longer doing anything. They are basically dark. Isaiah 30 says, actually, the sun and the moon are going to be brighter than they are now. And how do we handle that contradiction? The Gemara answers that this is not difficult. Lo kasha. This is not hard. Not hard doesn't mean that it doesn't need discussion. Not hard means that the explanation is ready at hand. The verse here in Isaiah 30 is written with regard to the days of the Messiah, when the sun and the moon will shine more brightly. The verse there in Isaiah 24 is written with regards to the world to come, when the only light will be the light of God. All right, so this passage from the Talmud is one of my favorites to use when talking about end of days, because it helps to introduce in a very confusing way the idea that there will be phases and stages. We've talked a couple times before about how Olam Haba, the world to come, is sometimes used to mean everything from the Messiah onward, and sometimes used to mean everything that is post-material existence for the soul and onward, what might be called heaven in English sort of nomenclature. Well, here we are seeing at least one rabbi try and give a distinction and saying that there are days of the Mashiach and then there are days of Olam Haba, and that some of the prophecies are referring to one and not the other, and we need to make sure that we can keep that clear. And his argument is that in the days of the Messiah, the natural world will shine brighter. We'll come back later, maybe today, to talk about whether that is a literal brightness or whether that is a metaphorical brightness, but it definitely is being used as a reference towards this world itself in that time of the Messiah, as opposed to the no sun, no moon discussion, which is being used, according to Rav Chisda, as a description of Olam Haba, the spiritual version, meaning the entire non-corporeal, soul exclusive in the presence of God, where, of course, in the presence of God, non-material world, the material light of the sun and the moon are not going to be significant, and the light of God would obviously drown out anything else in all of existence. That's one of the perks of being infinite. So Rav Chisda resolves this contradiction with a technique that we should bear in mind anytime we are reading biblical texts and rabbinic ones, that are we talking about the days of the Messiah? Are we talking about what comes after our physical existence? And are we sure that we've got that right? So hopefully you've got that idea now firmly in your mind, and you can keep that in your toolkit as well, that when you are looking at these different texts, that is part of how you try to analyze them, and also where you partly humbly will say, I'm not 100% sure. The Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, who says the difference between this world and the Messianic era is only subjugation of the exiles. Okay, so again, Talmudic style doesn't make for easy reading. Shmuel, one of the other great rabbis, has an opinion, which, as always, there are multiple opinions from different rabbis, so not every opinion is accepted by every other rabbi. That's okay in Judaism. In fact, we collect them in our books and use them for our study. Shmuel has the opinion that at the time where the Messianic era occurs, there will be no additional physical difference. In fact, the only difference between the Yemei HaMashiach, the time of the Messiah, and right now, meaning the days without the Messiah, unfortunately, is that the subjugation of the exile, that is to say, the subjugation and oppression of the Jewish people, will be done, will stop. And the Gemara, the Talmudic editors, are placing here a debate, a discussion, that follows a very familiar pattern, which is to say, if Rabbi A has an opinion, and then Rabbi B has a different opinion, and the opinion is not directly attacking Rabbi A, but it introduces a concept that will make a question for Rabbi A. Then we hand the microphone back to Rabbi A, or more often, we will hypothesize what Rabbi A would say as a response. And this is part of the back and forth discussion that the Talmud excels at. It's part of the skills that we are sorely lacking in our modern world, where we will say, oh, okay, hold on, you raised a good point, but that good point leads to a conclusion which is going to pose a problem for the other idea that this other guy had. And if I liked his idea, but now you've made this point, how am I going to fit those together? It's all about trying to see which one has the most coherence, which one has the most internal structure and logic, as well as which one seems to adhere best to both tradition and the text as we read it. So basically, this is saying, okay, you make a good point. There will be bright, bright light in the days of the Messiah. But wait, Shmuel said there wouldn't be anything weird going on in the world during the days of the Messiah, just the end of the exile. So how does he handle that text? Because doesn't that mean Shmuel is missing out on Isaiah 30 and 24 when he said the only difference is the subjugation? Hopefully I haven't made that too confusing for you, but it's basically, how would Shmuel handle these two verses, given that he doesn't believe in radical, miraculous change of the natural order during the time of the Messiah? All right, so how does he handle this? The Gemara answers, more or less on his behalf, that even according to Shmuel, this contradiction in the Isaiah passages is not difficult. The verse here in Isaiah chapter 30 is written with regard to the light in the camp of the righteous. That will be a completely blinding light, that the righteous will have perfect illumination. The verse there with the sun and the moon paling is written with regard to the camp of the divine presence, where only the light, when the only light will be the light of God, that there will be a differentiation that is made in those two categories. All right. Let's go ahead and continue. We're going to get a little diversion here from Rabbi Elazar, and then we'll get into some very meaty things, I think. Rabbi Elazar said, any communal leader who leads the community calmly, that is to say, without anger and honestly, is privileged and leads them in the worlds to come. As it is stated, for he that has compassion upon them will lead them, even by the springs of water shall he guide them. So again, a typical rabbinic reading where we'll have a two-part verse. And the question is, what's the second part doing? Well, if he's leading them with compassion, well, then even by the springs of water, which is used as a metaphor for Olam Haba of some variety, again, you can't say distinctly that this world to come is the heavenly realm or the messianic realm, but because there is a second guiding, leading them, that is what is being pointed at here, that the communal leader will be able to lead them there. Once again, as we've said multiple times, it's not always the focus of these texts to try and tell us in a journalistic fashion what will happen when. Very often the primary purpose is to tell us what to do now. And this is, of course, primarily coming in order to teach us how to lead, that a person should lead without anger, should lead honestly, should lead with compassion, that is the primary mode of leadership that is valued and venerated in Judaism. And if you see alternative versions, well, then you may not be leading the community towards the world to come. You may be, in fact, heading the wrong way. All right, but back to specifically what we know about the world to come and such. Let's go ahead and pick up with the school of Eliyahu. The righteous whom the Holy One, blessed be he, is destined to resurrect, do not return to their dust, as it is stated, and it shall come to pass that he who remains in Zion and he who remains in Jerusalem shall be called holy, anyone who is written unto life in Jerusalem. All right, now that verse may not seem very good at explaining what's meant by not returning to their dust, but thankfully we will have that explained in the commentary, well, not the commentary, but the explanation within the Talmud. Just as the Holy One exists forever, so too will they exist forever. And if you say, during those years when the Holy One, blessed be he, is destined to renew his world, as it's stated, and the Lord alone shall be exalted on that day, what are the righteous to do? Meaning, how will they survive? The Holy One, blessed be he, will make wings like eagles for them, and they will fly over the surface of the water, as it is stated. All right, let's get to the second part there in a second, but I'm imagining a little bit of confusion if you didn't catch the transition in the conversation. So the question here is, the righteous, will they die again? Right? That will they die a second time? And the school of Eliyahu is teaching no, that the righteous will be resurrected and they will not return to their dust. They will not be in their graves once more, because just as God is eternal, so too they are eternal, based off the parallels there in the two parts of verse 3, chapter 4 from Isaiah. Now, it brings for itself its own challenge, saying, but wait a minute. If people who are resurrected don't die, then aren't they going to be in trouble? And it introduces to the reader, if you've only picked up at this point in the Talmud, this rather unusual concept that God is going to be renewing the world. And that idea of renewal of the world, of a complete global remodel, is based upon the reading of Isaiah 2, chapter 2, verse 11, where it says, the Lord alone shall be exalted on that day. And again, on that day is often used as coded language for Olam Haba of one version or another. And so the question here is, wait a minute, if God is all alone, then what's going on with the righteous during this time, especially if they don't get killed again, they don't die at some point after their resurrection? So this is an attempt to reconcile all of these different concepts of a physical resurrection, an eternal existence, but God's eternity, God's remodeling of the world, and all of that. Now, one of the reasons why this is so complicated within the Talmud text and why it's not presented systematically is because the Talmud thinks that you know everything. The Talmud was not written as a textbook to teach you everything. It was written as a set of notes of the discussion and debates to remind you of what you already had learned. It really is like the class notes from the lecture. And just as class notes assume that you already heard the lecture and they're there just to remind you of the most important points, so too the Talmud assumes that you've already heard everything the Talmud has to teach you, and it's just going to sort of remind you. So it assumes that you know that there is a common belief, not universal, but common, that there will be this big remodeling where the entire world is going to be remade. And so you might be thinking, when someone else introduces the concept of the resurrection leading to an eternal physical life, that those two concepts would contradict. And the Talmud is trying to bring a reconciliation for that. Now, for that reconciliation, we've got wings. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, what are we talking about wings? Well, first of all, this is not angelic, right? Angels are not physical creatures. And this is still dealing with with the Eliyahu school of the physical resurrection. So what are we talking about with eagles here? Well, the Holy One, blessed be he, will make wings like eagles for them, and they will fly over the surface of the water. Water here being used as the remodeling tool, sort of bulldozing the world to improve it. Well, how do we know that? Well, Psalm 46, therefore we will not fear when God changes the land and when the mountains are moved in the midst of the sea. Well, see, we're talking about renewing the world here, and it's talking about mountains moving into the sea and everything being remodeled, and we're not afraid. So apparently we won't be afraid. Why would we not be afraid? Because we'll be flying. All right, what? Hold on, there is a little more explanation that makes that fit the text, this time from Isaiah, a little bit more logically. And lest you say that they will endure suffering, meaning from flying uninterrupted for an extended period, sort of, gee, thank you, God, you gave me wings, and now I don't have to be swept away in your remodeling. But how long do I have to fly? Because I'm getting tired up here. Well, we've got you covered. Isaiah 40 states, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not tire." So, no tiring here, right? That this is not something that will be suffered. In fact, it'll be perfectly fine. There will be no problem with the people maintaining their altitude during the remodeling of the world, as being hinted at in Psalm 46. Now, as always, does this mean this is literally what Eliyahu and his school of thought believed? Is this metaphorical? That I can't answer confidently. What I can say is that obviously we have other rabbis who have different opinions. We already saw Shmuel mentioned, who believes that there will be no physical difference in the world at all. That this is not about miracles and fancy things, that this will be about an end of suffering and an end of oppression. So you are able to take what you will and take solace in the fact that our tradition felt that all of these opinions were important enough to place in the Talmud as records. Obviously, some things were left out that were considered to be unsubstantiated and not supported by any of the community, but much was kept in precisely so that we could see that there were multiple ways of envisioning this time of reality. All right, speaking of envisioning, let's take a look at Ezekiel, which, as I talked about before, many of you might have been surprised that when we talked about the resurrection of the dead, the text of Ezekiel, chapter 37, did not figure prominently. Well, here comes another explanation of why that might be the case. The Gemara suggests, "And let us derive from the dead that Ezekiel revived, that the resurrected dead will not live forever, but will die at some point." What does that mean? Well, the Gemara explains. The school of Eliyahu, the ones who we just talked about with the eagle wings and not returning to dust, meaning that after the resurrection they don't die, the school of Eliyahu holds in accordance with the opinion of the one who says, in truth, and that is to say, Ezekiel's depiction of dry bones that came to life was a parable from which nothing can be derived with regard to the nature of resurrection. So, counter to what you might imagine, the school of Eliyahu believes that the story of the dry bones and the resurrection that is portrayed there, chapter 37, was in fact a parable. And thus, the fact that the people who would have been resurrected at that time did die doesn't tell us anything about what will happen when the real resurrection does occur in the future. So the people who are most pro-physical resurrection into an eternity of living are the ones that are most in favor of analyzing Ezekiel's text as being metaphoric, because they see it as referring to a parable of the past rather than the specific description of what will physically happen in the future. This is, as it is taught in the Braita. There is another text that supports the school of Eliyahu's opinion on this, that Rabbi Eliezer says, "The dead that Ezekiel revived stood on their feet and recited song to God and died." Right? That was a teaching from Rabbi Eliezer's school. And what song did they recite? "The Lord kills with justice and gives life with mercy." Rabbi Yehoshua says it was this song that they recited: "The Lord kills and gives life. He lowers to the grave and elevates." Meaning that the idea here was that there was a metaphorical statement of God's power and greatness, and that they were willing to appreciate it in that moment. That this was not something that teaches us about the future of the resurrection, but only of the message that was trying to be conveyed here in this type of reading of chapter 37. All right, now, if you're not happy with that reading of chapter 37, well, like I just said, we've got multiple opinions. And here comes Rabbi Yehuda, who has his own reading. Rabbi Yehuda says Ezekiel's depiction of the dry bones that came to life was truth, and it was a parable. Rabbi Nehemiah said to Rabbi Yehuda, if it was truth, why do you refer to it as a parable? And if it was a parable, why do you refer to it as truth? So this is something that you might hear in modern parlance as well. If something is metaphorical, then that means it's not true. And if something is true, then that means it can't be a metaphor. And that's the question that's being brought to Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, it means, in truth, it was a parable. And the Talmud cleans up the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and says, no, actually, you're right, Rabbi Nehemiah. Rabbi Yehuda did actually mean, in truth, it was a parable. It was not both simultaneously. Again, this is a common rabbinic technique of looking at a tradition, that is to say, a received opinion of one rabbi, checking it for consistency or problems in it, and then sometimes needing to slightly tweak it in order to make it more correct. This was and continues to be an important part of study. But Rabbi Eliezer returns us to our main theme. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, says, not only was it not a parable, the dead that Ezekiel revived ascended to Eretz Israel and married wives and fathered sons and daughters. All right, so Rabbi Yossi HaGalili is saying no to the idea of parable, that this was a completely literal event, that when Ezekiel was shown the valley of dry bones and he prophesied to them and they came back to life, this was not a vision, this was an event. And that event was so real that these people went on to live normal lives from that point forward and did all the normal stuff that normal people do. Now, if you're not sure whether or not to believe his opinion, well, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said, stood on his feet and said, I am a descendant of their sons, and these are phylacteries that my father's father left from them, meaning I have tefillin that came from these people. Now, does that mean that this is slam dunk, we're all done? It was definitely a literal action? Well, not necessarily, but it was definitely a belief within Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera's tradition that this was a literal action, and that is okay for there to be multiple opinions on this topic. But the Gemara wants to ask what is the obvious question for the rest of us. Who are the dead that Ezekiel revived, right? If we're saying this was a literal event, that they actually got up and walked around, who were they? Rav says they were the descendants of Ephraim, who calculated the time of the end, meaning of the enslavement and redemption from Egypt, and erred in their calculation. This is based on another tradition that indeed there were people from Ephraim that got their calculation of the Exodus wrong, and this led to some problems. They left before the appointed time and were killed, as it is stated. And these are the son of Ephraim, Shutlah and Bered his son, and Tahat his son, and Eladah his son, and Tahat his son, and Zabad his son, and Shutlah his son, and Ezer and Eliad, whom the men got that were born in the land slew, because they came down to take their cattle. And it was written, also in Chronicles, and Ephraim their father mourned many days, and his brothers came to comfort him. So the idea is that these sons of Ephraim had left early, and they ended up getting killed because it wasn't the right time for the Exodus. Now, that may sound like an interesting or perhaps not interpretation of the Chronicles passage here. But as I just mentioned moments ago, very often these stories are not just about what the journalistic account should be, but about what lessons should be learned. And in particular, as we will see extensively in some of our coming studies, the calculation of the end is a big topic, that there are many opinions that say those who try to calculate the end, in this case, the Exodus, but in our case, the end of days, get themselves into trouble. That trying to work out God's plan mathematically and then saying, aha, I know what's going to happen, so I will do something, in this case, leaving Egypt, is a good way to get yourself killed. And in fact, the rabbis were all too familiar with false messianic movements that were done in their own days. And we now in 2026 have seen numerous false messianic movements over the last few thousand years that have ended up causing immeasurable problems to ourselves and others. So this is really the focus here of taking the opportunity to talk about Ezekiel's resurrection of the dead, which gives us hope for the future, but to also curtail the enthusiasm of too many people who keep trying to calculate the end, thinking they're going to figure it out, and then even worse, make decisions based upon those calculations that can lead to real problems. So continuing on, let's get us lined up here a little more. And Shmuel says, these dead that the Ezekiel revived were the people who denied the resurrection of the dead. Shmuel, having a great sense of humor and irony, says the people that Ezekiel brought back were the people who refused to believe in the resurrection of the dead. As it is stated, he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off. Sounds like people who don't believe in resurrection as being a possibility. Now, in context, as we talked about when we looked at Ezekiel 37 on its own, this seems to be a metaphor for the people of Israel that are feeling hopeless, that are in Babylon, that believe that their entire nation is destroyed, that there is no way that this will ever go well. And Ezekiel is prophesying to them that, in fact, their bones will live again, that they are not dried and lacking in life. They will be able to be brought back, which of course does happen physically with the return of the exiles a few years later. But Shmuel is taking this as being a more literal declaration that the bones are saying, basically for themselves, for the people that left them behind, we don't believe we can be resurrected. They are denying that possibility. Rabbi Yamira ben Abba says, these were people in whom there was not even the moist residue of a mitzvah. As it is stated, the dry bones hear the word of the Lord. Right? Even during their lifetime, they were comparable to the dry bone. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Napacha says, these are people who covered the sanctuary with repugnant creatures, creeping animals. As it is stated, so I entered and saw, and behold, every form of creeping animal and repugnant animal, and all the idols of the house of Israel etched upon the walls around. And it is written there, with regard to the prophecy of the dry bones, and he passed me over them around and around. By means of a verbal analogy, what we call a gezerah shava, we see that around, that word in one verse, and the identical term around in the other, it is derived that the two verses are referring to the same people. Again, a common technique of saying, here we have word A, here we have word A, therefore we can find some commonality between the two verses in their message and meaning. All right, so we've got three different rabbis here who are providing alternative interpretations for the dead. Well, four technically when we have the Ephraim one already, but these last three are also very interesting, because when we began our look into Sanhedrin, the section of Talmud, the first thing we saw was that those who deny the resurrection of the dead have no share in the worlds to come. And yet, here we have Shmuel saying that, indeed, they were resurrected. So perhaps they do. We also have here with the idea that those that had forsaken God and not been doing any mitzvot also apparently are being called back to life. And then, of course, the most extreme version and the last version, the last text, is those who had purposefully and willfully joined in the desecration of the temple itself. So not merely a denial of the resurrection, not merely a not keeping of the mitzvot, but an active antagonism of desecration. All of those people are brought back as well. So each one of these has an escalating idea of expanding the franchise of resurrection to more and more of the nation. So rather than keeping it only for the righteous, we are seeing many more people being picked up in this process. And when we get to our discussion about the rabbinic views of judgment, we'll come back to why that is happening and why In fact, Judaism has a much more open door policy when it comes to Olam Haba than you might have first thought. Obviously, we still focus on the good that we are meant to do here, and this should not be taken as being don't care what you do, it doesn't matter. It will absolutely matter according to every opinion when it comes time for judgment at the end. But don't believe that there is a minimum that must be met before judgment will take place and before that phase of our existence will happen. That is something that is open, but you may not be happy with the consequences depending upon how you have lived your life. All right. Just give me a moment. Because the next section is moving away from the resurrection of the dead and into the concept of the restoration of David, or rather, more generally talking about the political landscape of the end of days, of what will it actually feel like during this messianic era. And as we talked about in our earlier examination of text, as well as prayer, the idea of David and the house of David being restored is a prominent one. As always, the Talmud is not going to come straight to the point super fast, so just hold on and we'll see how far we can get today. The Gemara cites that which is stated, that the government may be increased and of peace there be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it through justice and through righteousness from now and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts does perform this. Isaiah 9, very strong statement about the throne of David, meaning the restoration of the kingdom of David as being part of our future vision. So, what's going on here that needs further commentary? Well, obviously everything. Rabbi Tanhum says that Bar Kaparatat in Kippuri, due to what reason is it that every letter mem in the middle of a word is open, and this mem of the word lemarbet is closed? All right. The commentary will point out that in the Masoretic text, that is to say, in the accepted version of the text that has come down to us for thousands of years, the letter mem in this word is written in the form of a mem that appears at the end of a word, what we call a final mem or a mem sophit. That is a little box-shaped mem, whereas a mem that's in the middle of a word that is not a final mem is made with sort of a little hump, a little bit poking off the top, but where the hump comes around, it does not join the bottom line. There is a gap. And so the question is, why does this mem in the middle of a word have four sides to it, which is totally weird? No middle word mem is written like that. If you go to Hebrew school and you write a mem in the middle of a word and you use the final mem form, you did it wrong. And tip to the wise, for those of you that have ever read old Jewish books, oftentimes the font that was favored, I don't know how long, actually creates a samech in a shape that looks very much like a final mem. Sometimes the only difference is a little slice off of one corner of the samech, whereas the mem has sharp corners. And for those of us who need a little eyeglass assistance, sometimes it's not always so clear. But you can rest assured that if you see a letter in the middle of a word in any textbook or siddur, that it's not going to be a final mem, it has to be a samech. So that is something you can rely on, something that still comes up routinely when I'm teaching people the blessing after the Haftarah. And you can look through that on your own to find out what the common mistake is for people that are just a little bit less familiar with what a samech looks like. Okay, so back to our text in Isaiah, when it talks about increasing the government, the word that's used has this weird choice of using a final mem in the middle of a word. And you could just say, well, we write it as we got it, which we do. But is there some lesson we can learn from this? Okay, here comes the lesson. This is because the Holy One, blessed be he, sought to designate King Hezekiah as the Messiah and sought to designate Sennacherib and Assyria, respectively, as God and Magog. That is to say, all from the prophecy of Ezekiel with regard to the end of days in chapter 38. All right, and thus the confrontation between them would culminate in the final redemption. All right, here we go. So let's just deal with the straightforward meaning of what's being said. Then we'll talk about why this might feel difficult, and then we'll talk about why it shouldn't feel difficult. So Hezekiah was one of the good kings of Judah. There weren't a lot. That is to say, that were really of a good benchmark. Hezekiah was considered one of the good kings. He's a descendant of David, obviously on target here, but he predates the destruction of the the first temple, and he predates Ezekiel by a couple hundred years. However, what is being argued here is that, in fact, Hezekiah was meant to be the Messiah. Yes, he was, of course, anointed because he was a king, but he was meant to be HaMashiach, the Messiah, the one that would actually usher in redemption. And Sennacherib, who was the emperor of the Assyrian Empire at that time, were going to play the role of Gog and Magog, Gog coming from the country of Magog. And thus, their showdown would have been the final battle, and that would have ushered in redemption. And, well, 2,500 years worth of history would not have happened the way it has, because we already would have entered into the Messianic time. And I would be giving this class as a history class rather than as a speculative analysis of Jewish thought about the future. Okay. Obviously, that didn't happen because we're not in Messianic time. Judaism is very clear that once the Messiah comes, it will not be an up and down. Once it happens, it will be everything gets good and stays good. Very important in Jewish concept. One of the reasons why we have rejected every messianic candidate so far, because if you look around, we're not in that period of perfect peace. So yeah, no matter how good your credentials are, you didn't finish the job, you don't get to have the title, and we're waiting for the real one. All right. So the question, the underlying question here that you might be feeling is a little strange is, wait, is God like looking for an opportunity for the Messiah? I thought this was all orchestrated and calculated. I thought that the Messiah was something that was planned from the beginning, like with a fixed date in mind. I mean, after all, we will eventually look at different rabbinic texts trying to calculate when this might happen. This feels like God wanted Hezekiah to be Messiah, but then something went wrong. I mean, what, God didn't anticipate that? Well, what's going on? All right, so obviously God's not making mistakes. But more importantly, what are we meant to learn from this about ourselves and our own history? That is always the focus. So let's go ahead and see if we can't unpack some of this. So why would it have been that a potential messianic moment was missed during the time of Hezekiah? I should also point out here, you'll note that this does also help place the idea that messianic potential is something that is more general. It doesn't have to be just one person, but that in fact there could be messianic potential in most. And please do not go crazy on that. It just means that we cannot do a DNA test to say, oh, this person is the Messiah. When someone becomes the Messiah, it will be a fulfillment. It won't necessarily be their destiny. Likewise, the designation of Gog and Magog is not up to cartographers. This is not just about geography. This is about which group is playing the role of somebody opposed to this redemption of the world. Okay, so that aside, let's go back to this missed moment. The attribute of justice said before the Holy One, "Blessed be he, master of the universe," meaning he's saying God, come on. And if, with regard to David, king of Israel, who recited several songs and praises before you, you did not designate him as the Messiah, right? I mean, David was a pretty upstanding guy. I mean, look at the book of Psalms. And yes, he made a few mistakes, but overall, pretty great guy. But you didn't let David be the Messiah. Then, with regard to Hezekiah, for whom you performed all these miracles, such as delivering him from Sennacherib and healing his illness, and he did not recite praises before you, meaning we don't have a great body of literature from Hezekiah the same way we do from David. So maybe he was not quite as grateful and thus not as worthy as David. Then you would designate him as the Messiah? That's not fair. If David wasn't good enough to be Messiah, then Hezekiah, who seems to be less good than David, isn't good enough to be Messiah either. Therefore, game on, right? The clock is still going and the game's not over, and we'll have to wait for somebody better than David to become the Messiah, says the attribute of justice. Now, it is for this reason, goes this line of arguing, that the mem was closed, because there was an opportunity for redemption and it was thwarted. So it was going to increase, it was going to get better, but got blocked. And it got blocked because it wasn't fair. The attribute of justice was not satisfied, and thus it didn't happen. Okay. Immediately, the earth began and stated before him, Master of the universe, I will recite a song before you in place of that righteous person, meaning Hezekiah, and designate him as the Messiah. So the attribute of justice says he's not good enough. And the earth itself says, whoa, whoa, whoa. If the only thing he's not good enough for is he didn't give a good song of thanks, I'll do it for you. I'll do it for him, rather. Right? All right, here I go. As it is stated, the earth began and recited a song before him, as it is stated. From the uttermost part of earth have we heard songs. Glory to the righteous. But I said, my secret is mine. My secret is mine. Woe unto me. The treacherous deal treacherously. The treacherous deal very treacherously. So this is taken from Isaiah, who lived during the time of Hezekiah. New player in the story. The angel appointed to oversee the world said before him to God, Master of the universe, perform the will of this righteous person. They're advocating on behalf of Hezekiah. The divine word emerged and said, my secret is mine. My secret is mine. Meaning this matter will remain secret as I am not yet bringing redemption. The prophet said, woe unto me, until when will the exile continue? The divine voice emerged and said, the treacherous deal treacherously, the treacherous deal very treacherously. All right, so essentially what happens in this latter part of this paragraph is this version from Isaiah 24 comes, ostensibly as being voiced by the earth on behalf of Hezekiah, but we see that this verse could actually be broken into pieces. Rather than being a single hymn from the earth or from Hezekiah, it can actually be broken into pieces. So Hezekiah says, or the earth says on behalf of Hezekiah, glory to the righteous, but the angel says, my secret is mine, right? That this is going to be, or rather God says this secret is mine. This is not going to happen the way you expect. Much like when we had our class on suffering, we saw that God's ways are not intelligible to anyone else, including angels in the earth. There will not be a full explanation for why redemption didn't happen at that point. At which point we read the rest of the text, woe unto me, that Isaiah is like, why is it secret? I wish I could tell. Please, God, tell us what is going to happen. But God responds not with an explanation of when it will finish, but rather by saying the treacherous deal treacherously. Yes, this is bad, and there is much treachery in the world. So we're left not knowing from Isaiah 24 when redemption will come. Now, that doesn't mean we're done with this topic, because Rava, and some say Rabbi Yitzchak, do want to enter one of our earliest attempts to try and ascertain the day, meaning what are some of the signs that we are in a period that is potentially available for messianic redemption. And this is going to be a topic of conversation for many different texts of, okay, we can't calculate the day, more on that another time, but maybe we can at least figure out when the day is possible. And if I can't narrow down when it will happen, can I at least rule out when it couldn't happen and know when it might? And this is the first attempt that we've talked about together, where they put together a sign. And the sign is, until the looters and looters of looters come, the Messiah will not come. So basically, until all of the law and order break down, we're not going to have it. That not only will there need to be people who come to loot, but there will need to be such chaos and anarchy that even the people who rob will in turn be robbed by other robbers, because this will not be an orchestrated loot. This will not be a systematic loot. This will be complete chaos. Alternatively, another way of reading this is saying loot in the military sense, that there will be a conquest that comes with loot, and then those who conquer will be looted, that there will be successive and perhaps rapid fire rise and fall of different nations, each that try to loot one another. And this will create the conditions in which the Messiah could come. Now, we're going to wrap up for here, because the next section I want to continue more cohesively next week. But this begins to show you some of the problems of figuring out even signs. Like I said, we've talked about the idea of calculating the day precisely in general. We'll look at the actual rabbinic text on that eventually. But calculating the day is very, very dangerous, because either it's so far off that people have no hope, or it's so close that it passes and it doesn't happen and people despair. So you're really shooting yourself in the foot. Well, declaring signs with any degree of specificity is likewise very problematic, because if we're not having looters and looters of looters, then does that mean I shouldn't hope for the Messiah tomorrow? Does that mean the Messiah can't come because it's not bad enough? Or God forbid, like some people in modern politics, should I make things worse, be an accelerationist in order to create the fertile ground for the Messiah? The answer to the last one is no, by the way. But the looking for signs is extremely problematic. So this is something we will touch on again and again. Recognize, like we've said before, or like we've discussed before, that when the rabbis are talking about these ideas of looters and looters, or dealing treacherously, or what we'll look at next week, it isn't necessarily trying to create that journalistic experience. It is trying to create a lesson of what we should think about for now. One of the lessons that we come away with from rabbinic texts about the days preceding the Messiah is, well, they call it the birth pangs of the Messiah, meaning labor, the labor pains. And, well, labor hurts, quite famously. And we should sometimes be a little hesitant about how we anticipate these days. Doesn't mean we don't hope for the Messiah, but we have to recognize that things might be bad before the Messiah comes, in ways that are worse than they currently are. And I'll leave that as part of our introduction for next week. But until then, keep studying, keep learning, keep hoping, and keep acting. Remember, Judaism is always about hope with action, action with hope. Take care, everyone, and be well.